Out of room. Hi, Founder fans. Hey, Matthew, right on. Came right in. Thanks for coming. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Founder of the Day's Week in Review, where we will discuss the last 7 articles I published for founderoftheday.com. Thank you so much for joining me. As people start rolling in, just to reiterate, all 5 of these articles are brand new. 2 of them, the ones I published on Saturday and Sunday, are older articles, but we'll talk about them anyway. And on Fridays, I publish about a Federalist paper. However, I am going to skip that through my week and save that for last. It just seems right to do the Federalist last. I don't know why. That's just how I feel about things. Maybe because I've been publishing them on Fridays for almost 2 years. And that's the end of the week. So, thanks everyone for joining me. If you guys would hit like, that would help me out a ton. Excuse me, I'm going to talk a lot, so I'm going to take a quick sip of water. Because it's hot. I don't know if it's hot by you guys. It is hot around me. But let's get into it. I don't want to waste any of your time. And we will start on last Thursday when I published an article about Robert Townsend. Now, Townsend has become fairly famous because he was a member of the Culper Spy Ring. And the Culper Spy Ring, of course, in the last few years has had a television show based on it. Turn is called on AMC, I believe it was. And as for Townsend, he seems to have been a fairly not reluctant, but hesitant person to join. So he was a Quaker, and Quakers weren't supposed to fight. Now, I have read that there was a divide going on at the time, at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, between the Quaker factions. One faction was really holding on to the nonviolence and old-time Quaker traditions, and one was becoming a bit more modern when it came to Quakering, so to speak. Sorry if that's offensive, I don't know. Anyway, so Townsend was part of this new school where they did want to help. He did want to participate in the revolution a little bit. So, Townsend, if you'll excuse me for 1 second. And I'm back. These cats, man. I apologize tremendously. My camera didn't fall over this week, so that's great. So anyway, let's talk about Robert Townsend. Robert Townsend was living in New York City, and he was a fairly successful merchant, and he had access to fairly high levels of British who had now occupied by this point New York City. And he seemed to be an acquaintance with Abraham Woodhull, who was running the Culper Spy Ring out of Setauket. Now, as far as we know about Robert Townsend, his code name was Culper Jr. It was called the Culper Spy Ring. Abraham Woodhull running the things was Culper Sr. and Townsend was Culper Jr. Townsend was so secretive that he told Woodhull not to even tell Washington his name. He didn't want anyone to know who he was, and he did a very good job of that. So much so that after the war was over, still Abraham Woodhull was the only one who knew his name. And Townsend actually took his secret to the grave. He died 50 years later. He lived to be a very old man, and he was still in his late 20s at this point. And he lived to be a very old man, and he took that secret to his grave. Now, fortunately, there was an historian on Long Island named Morton Pennypacker. Let me make sure I'm saying that right, because I always feel like I'm saying his name wrong. His name was Morton Pennypacker. Great name. He was living on Long Island in the 1930s, and he was a collector of not just Americana, but Long Island history and things of that nature. And he's the one who realized he had a few of the Culper letters that he collected, and he had some Townsend letters that he collected. And he's the one who realized, hey, these are the same handwriting. So it wasn't until the 1930s, which is, 160 years after the war, that we actually figured out, hey, Robert Townsend was Culper Jr. Now, Culper did a lot of things, although he was, again, so secretive about who he was and what he was doing, that some of his communications were fairly sparse. But of the really important things he did accomplish, he found out that the British were hatching a plan to counterfeit American currency. And not just were they going to counterfeit it, but they had actually somehow gotten their hands on the same paper that the Americans used to print their currency. So they would have actually essentially been printing continental currency, and their plan was to flood the colonies with this currency and devalue the continental to the point where it was absolutely worthless. And fortunately, because Townsend was able to find out about this plan, he got it through to Washington, who got it to the Continental Congress, who was able to change the bills and bring the currency back and change it up, and somehow able to thwart this terrible happening, so to speak. Also, Townsend was able to infiltrate very high levels of British society. And he actually, one of the reasons he was so secretive about things is he knew that if there were certain things that if Washington knew the British were going to do, well, hey, guess what? Obviously, Townsend was the person to blame, because no one else could have known. He was in certain situations. Now, again, we don't really know how he did this. The show turn makes some assumptions, but we don't really know because he was so secretive about what he did. He was also able to, what was it? There was another one. Several things. Oh, what he mostly did is he was able to determine, and what Washington wanted him to do, was determine where troops were being moved by the British so that Washington could then get troops there and have more numbers for each engagement. And also, when the French came, the French were coming, he was able to warn Washington that the British were planning to attempt to intercept the French Navy when they arrived off Rhode Island. And because of that, the Americans were able to make it seem like they were attacking down off Staten Island on the south part of New York, which forced the British to divert some of their troops and ships, and therefore allowed the French to land pretty much hassle-free. So let me know if you have any questions. There's a lot about Culper and Culper Jr., Robert Townsend. I always want to default and call him Culper. Robert Townsend. There's a ton to know about him. If you have any questions, please let me know. I don't see anything quite yet, but he's also got a lot of information out there. The book I recommended last week, Washington Spies, is a great, fantastic book, and it talks all about him. So, continuing on, over the weekend, I published about John Parke Custis. John Parke Custis was from a very rich family, and his father died when he was just 3 years old, and his mother remarried, and her name was Martha, and she married George Washington. So, John Parke Custis was George Washington's stepson and grew up at Mount Vernon under the watchful eye of George Washington. So, Custis goes on and he inherits a bunch of property, which he gets when he's about 19, 20, when he comes of age, and he moves there. He ends up getting married very young, and Martha and George Washington tried to talk him out of this because he was very young when he got married, but he was in love, so he got married. They moved to this land that his father owned, but then he decides to purchase some other land with his inheritance, and Washington ends up scolding him a few times in his life for decisions he made, but George gets mad at this because he ends up buying property and putting more money into the property than he's getting out of it, which is not really something you should ever do. I mean, nowadays, you buy a house, you put money into it, but back then, you were supposed to be making money off your property. You weren't supposed to just be investing in it. He was scolded for making that rash decision, for getting married young, blah, blah, blah. Either way, the war breaks out, and Custis actually serves on George Washington's staff. He serves as an aide-de-camp to George Washington for a few months early in the war. But then, seemingly, war wasn't for him, and he does leave and goes home to work on private business, but he actually is elected to the House of Burgesses. So, John Parke Custis goes to the Virginia House of Burgesses during the Revolution and helps oversee the most populated, powerful state in the Union while the Revolution is going on. Now, he does seem to speak a little bit out of turn, especially for a junior member of this body, where from some of the letters I read, George Washington, again, scolding him for his behavior, Custis seems to have been speaking out of turn, or I guess I'll say, speaking too much for a junior member when he should have been there following. Washington essentially told him, you go there and you show up on time, and that's it. That's all you do. And we don't know if he did or did not follow that lead or those instructions. But Custis does end up joining the war again as a civilian, and he goes and helps. He actually helps during the Battle of Yorktown. He helps support the Continental Army in its biggest, most important victory that essentially wins the war. And unfortunately, he gets sick. And just a few days later, he dies. And it's probably dysentery. He caught camp fever, which was probably dysentery, and died quickly, and he was just 26 years old, which of course was sad for the whole Washington family, especially Martha, especially with Christmas time coming. Always sad. The Washingtons had very few happy Christmases, as I believe I wrote about a while ago. So, that's the story of John Parke Custis, George Washington's stepson. Let me know if you have any questions about that. I'll do a quick check, although I didn't see any come in. Thanks for coming, guys. Thanks for the likes. I really appreciate you being here. Like I said, any questions you got, let me know. I'll be happy to answer them. Moving on Sunday, I published about John Parke Custis's best friend, John Price Posey. John Price Posey grew up with John Parke Custis and was a regular childhood visitor at Mount Vernon. Now, they grew up together. Posey was from a less wealthy family. I mean, not only was Custis from the Washington family, but he was a Custis, which was actually more wealthy, so he came from real wealth. Posey came from moderate wealth, but they were neighbors and he was friendly and they grew up together. As for him, Posey actually, while George Washington's away, first of all, Posey becomes a caretaker for John Parke Custis's property, and he takes care of his house when he's away. He also ends up doing several favors and running several errands for George Washington while Washington is away fighting the Revolution. By the time the war is over, right about just after Yorktown, Posey's actually elected to become a Justice of the Peace, which is essentially would oversee what we consider small claims court today. It's not the highest rank in the world, but it's an important one that society needs, and he did that, seemingly successful, for a while. But a few months later, as we mentioned, his best friend, John Parke Custis, passes away. And this seems to have kind of flipped a switch in John Price Posey's mind, because he kind of dives into a life of crime. First of all, he's accused of embezzling funds from Custis's estate, which he was supposed to help distribute. He's also acted directly by George Washington, who confronts him via letter saying, "What are you doing? What's wrong with you? Well, where did you go?" He's then because of these problems, he's fired from his job as Justice of the Peace. A few years later, he ends up getting in trouble for destroying a bond, which was an official document of the government, and that's a no-no. Now, he has a lot of powerful friends. Somehow he avoids doing any time in prison, but by 1788, he assaults a sheriff. Now, again, this is not something you should be doing, because it's bad news. You're probably going to get in trouble, and he did. He was actually quickly sentenced to a month in prison. Now, somehow, Posey breaks out of prison. And he goes and gets a friend, and he gets 2 slaves. And the next day, he comes back. And he and these 3 accomplices burn down the jail. And then they go down the street, and they burn the county courthouse. Now, let me rephrase that. The county clerk's office. I knew there was something wrong. He burns down the jail, and they burn down the county clerk's office, and then they run off into the woods. Now, they're apprehended the next day. Obviously, he's not a good criminal. He gets caught seemingly every time he does something wrong. And he gets brought down, and then he gets tried, and he's put on trial and quickly convicted, and he's sentenced to death. Now, unfortunately, he does try to reach out to many of the more famous people that he knows, But that doesn't work, and they end up upholding his conviction. So Posey is, he even reached out to George Washington, as I said, and Washington writes back and says, no, I won't help you because you've done a terrible thing here. And Posey is hung for his crime. John Parke Custis, George Washington's stepson's best friend, who grew up in the Washington household, was hung for his crimes. Now, I want to put some context onto this. This is early 1788. The United States Constitution had just been written a few months beforehand and signed a few months beforehand. It was in the middle of the ratification process. At this point, I believe it was 5 states. I believe it was 5 states had just ratified, with Massachusetts about to also do the same. So they're halfway to creating the new government. And one of the main reasons for the new government was for law and order. They were very serious about law and order. They were afraid of things like Shays' Rebellion and the people not behaving in an orderly fashion as they are expected to behave. So, unfortunately, that's one of the reasons Washington seems to step away. I mean, Washington at this point is also trying to get the Constitution passed. He's not out there openly saying it, but he's writing letters to very powerful people who are against the Constitution, trying to sway their opinion, and he does successfully on many occasions. And for him to turn around and help someone he knows being lawless would look absolutely terrible, especially for someone who probably had an inkling that if the Constitution passed, he'd be the first president. I don't know how, I should look more into that. I don't know how Washington didn't assume he would be the first president, because everyone else did. So he must have known and was always tried to keep a clean image, but seemed to be keeping an especially clean image this time. And there's something else that's the saddest part of this whole story, is the county clerk house, the county clerk's office that Posey burned had all the documents for that county. Did I have the county? I'm not sure if New Kent County, Virginia. And many important founders lived in New Kent County, and many important things happened in New Kent County. And all of the documentation that we today, as history fans, would like to look back on and read, were burnt and destroyed. And we have John Price Posey to be angry at for that loss. That's John Price Posey. I did see a question come in, Matthew. I didn't know they had sheriffs. You never hear about them. Okay, interesting. So, yes. Now, again, not only was each state different in how they handled policing, but each county, each town even, could be different in how they handle policing. But generally speaking, each town, much like they would elect justices, or even like we do today, we still elect a sheriff, or many places still elect a sheriff. And what they would do is they would elect a sheriff to enforce the law. Now, there wouldn't be a police department or anything like that as we know it now. He would just kind of be in charge of enforcing the law, usually in that county. And what he would do is go and say you're under arrest, and people would come back with him nice and polite. And if that didn't work, he would recruit. There were also some deputies, several sheriffs had deputies, but he would generally go and recruit people from the militia and say, hey guys, I need you to help me bring this one in. That's a very glossed over way sheriffs and policing work, but sheriffs were elected. And again, much as they are generally can be today. It's interesting because when they wrote in the Constitution and they wrote the Second Amendment, the Second Amendment, they saw that as part of the police force in a fashion. I don't want to get too into that. And the Second Amendment, of course, is a very touchy subject that no matter what I say, someone's going to not like, no matter how accurate it is. Because, of course, as I've said before, you can't just say, the founders, blah, blah, blah. And that gets thrown around a lot with the Second Amendment. But a lot of people's idea with the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms was for, people to police themselves. Was one of many reasons the Second Amendment was approved. If you have any other questions, please let me know. If not, I am going to move on to the San Juan Expedition. On Monday, I wrote an article that's probably different than any other article I've written. Well, there's the one in India, so not everyone. It's one of the few articles that not only doesn't discuss a founder, every once in a while I write about an event and don't really talk about one founder, but it doesn't talk about any Americans. But it is an extension of the Revolutionary War. Now, of course, once France declared war on Britain to join the American revolutionaries, that turned into a world war. It became, instead of just some American colonies fighting off their British motherland, to all the French colonies and the Americans fighting all the British colonies. Hostilities were mostly in America, but they did participate around the world. That being said, and it became known as the Anglo-French War. Why do I feel like I'm saying that wrong? It became one of the many Anglo-French wars of 78 or 79 maybe. And of course, Britain and France love fighting each other. That's happened for almost 1,000 years. But we forget that right about the time France declared war on Britain, so did Spain. Spain was a very important member of the war. They were notoriously difficult to treat with, as John Jay would tell you, but they were very important, especially Bernardo de Galvez, who was the Spanish governor of Louisiana, who at this point owned Louisiana. It would, of course, become French very briefly before becoming American. But New Spain was humongous. It went from basically the top of South America all the way through Central America, all the way through Mexico, all of California, all of Texas, all of up to Colorado. It was gigantic. But some British people saw an opportunity. So John Dalling was the British governor of the island of Jamaica. Jamaica, of course, was a colony. And he saw, right in the middle, in 1780, while the war's going on the mainland, he saw an opportunity. He wanted to attack part of what is now Nicaragua. Yes, we're talking about Nicaragua now. The area he wanted to capture was called Grenada. And the idea was twofold. First of all, you could cut off a big chunk of Central America. You can cut that off from Spain, which would give Britain a lot of colonies in case they ended up losing these American ones, which is a bonus. But more importantly, it would give them access to ports on the Pacific Ocean, which they really didn't have in North America. They had them in Asia, but they wanted them everywhere because the sun never set on the British Empire, and they really wanted to solidify that with a port, or a few ports, on the Pacific. So, he picks two gentlemen to lead this expedition. An Army Captain, John Poison, which is another really cool name. John Poison, and Naval Captain Horatio Nelson. Now, that's a name you might recognize, and I'll get to that in a second. But, technically, Horatio Nelson was the senior officer on this expedition, but he was only 21 years old. And since John Poison ran the army, essentially Poison took the lead on this particular expedition. Now, by all accounts, everything I read said they worked together very swimmingly anyway, so that seemed to be good for them. Usually in these situations, there was some tension. This time they seemed to go together really well. So they go up the San Juan River, and that's where the San Juan Expedition gets its name. They go up the San Juan River, and they take the Fortress of Immaculate Conception pretty easily. They win a few other skirmishes going up, and things are going really well. And then they get to Fort, and I want to get this right, Fort San Juan. Also why it's called the San Juan Expedition. I thought that was the case. I didn't want to speak until I double-checked. I write a lot every week. I don't want to get things confused. You'll forgive me. So he goes up, they lay siege to Fort San Juan. Now, they have 3,000 people approximately, and Fort San Juan has maybe 200. So they lay siege for 2 weeks, and after 2 weeks, the Spanish at that fort give up pretty easy. They seem to be treated nice, no big deal. The British take over. But 2 things happen. First of all, it's April in 1780, but it's April in the tropical paradise of Nicaragua, and they are not ready for the disease that comes. Furthermore, while they do get 1 set of reinforcements, they have a lot of trouble getting enough food and supplies to these men and enough more reinforcements to continue. Again, their goal was to get further towards Lake Nicaragua and get further towards the Pacific. But they didn't have enough people to do that, and they get ravaged by disease. Ravaged. It's to the point where, like, anyone who's not sick and dying deserts. Poison, I couldn't find a lot about his life from here on out, but it seems he's taken from there pretty quick, and it seems like he dies from this. The one thing I saw did say he was a casualty of this expedition, but I couldn't confirm that, so I don't really know what happens to him in the future. But Horatio Nelson gets sick, and he gets taken away too. Eventually, of the 3,500 people, about 2,500 die or desert. Most of them die from sickness. Which pretty much ends the San Juan expedition. They end up leaving. They burn Fort San Juan on their way out, as tends to happen when someone evacuates an enemy fort, and the Spanish come back and take it a few months later. Now, the Spanish end up getting revenge for this. There's an event called the Capture of the Bahamas, where essentially the Spanish, helping us out, capture the Bahamas. Now, I'm not going to get too into that. That's another thing. Maybe I'll write an article about it this week, and we can talk about it next week. That's actually a great idea. I will do that. But that's their revenge. As for Horatio Nelson, he goes on to be one of the most famous naval admirals in British history. He has several, I didn't read too much into him. To be quite open and honest, I don't know a whole lot about him, but I knew the name as soon as I saw it, and I went, what? And then I looked it up, and I was like, oh yeah, it is that guy. I should do more research on that, but I spend a whole lot of my life researching the American Revolution. And he, during the Napoleonic Wars, he really makes an important mark. Okay, so yeah, other than the Siege of Pondicherry in India, this is the only article I've written that just doesn't involve any Americans. So, sorry. Let me know if you have any questions. I will check to see. Nope, you guys are quiet today. That's okay. That's okay. Let's move on. So, on whatever days after Monday, I suppose it would be Tuesday, I wrote about Lund, Washington. Maybe it's Lund, Washington? Lund, Washington. Lund, Washington was a cousin of another Washington. Guess who? General George. That's right. He was cousins of George Washington. And I do want to pause real quick and say, the book I'm reading this week is about Richard Henry Lee, which I know seems out of the ordinary. It's the first founding father by Harlow Giles Unger, who's written several biographies on American founders. A lot of times when I write about someone, it's because I'm reading a book and I'm like, oh, I don't know that name. I'll look him up later. I write it down. And later that day, I take what I read in the book and learn more about him. And this book told me he was the caretaker for Mount Vernon, which he was. And we'll get into that. I did put a link to in the description to this. I like to recommend a book every week. As you can see, I have not even finished this one. I'm recommending it. It's really interesting. It takes the point of view of Richard Henry Lee, who, first of all, was an important founding father. He's the one who said, hey, we should declare independence in Congress. He didn't just say, he resolved that they declare independence. He was also part of the Lee family, so his brother Francis Lightfoot signed the Declaration of Independence. His brothers William and Arthur were important. They were already in London when the war broke out and became important diplomats for the Americans. And he was very close with George Washington. So he actually, most of the book is him tracing the correspondence between Lee and George Washington. It's a very interesting point of view. He talks a lot about their time in York when they were out of Philadelphia too. So check it out if you want to. It's a very easy read. I'm getting through it so quick. That's why I was like, oh, okay, I'll put this out there. he is a little bit biased towards Lee, specifically with the Silas Deane incident, which I've talked about before, and there's another book I like, Unlikely Allies, I've recommended before, about Silas Deane, who kind of got the screw job from the Lee family while he was over in Europe, bringing us the French, essentially. Ben Franklin gets all the credit. Silas Deane did just as much, if not more, than Ben Franklin to get the French on our side, and the Lee family ruined his life for it. And he only briefly mentions that in this book, and kind of makes Deane seem like the bad guy and brushes him off, which, don't love that. Big Silas Deane fan. Anyway, let's get to Lund, Washington. This book told me that Lund, Washington was the caretaker at Mount Vernon, so I researched it, and boy was he. First of all, he had already been a caretaker on another estate when he was in his late 20s, and George asked him to come take care of Mount Vernon. He wasn't quite as rich as Washington, especially because Washington had married, as we discussed before, into the Custis family, vicariously through his wife, even though Martha Washington married into the Custis family, and George married her. So George never actually had that money. That was always going to John Parke Custis, but I digress. Lund, Washington comes in, takes care of Mount Vernon. Now, the first thing I actually read about it in this book is Washington, at one point, the British published, first in London and then in New York and Philadelphia, published letters that were allegedly from George Washington criticizing the war and saying we shouldn't have declared independence, Congress is doing a terrible job. Now, these were forgeries, and it was kind of obvious. But, interestingly, 2 of the letters were supposed to be to Martha Washington, and 5 of them were to his caretaker, Lund, Washington. And I was like, oh, look at that. So, Lund, Washington, really the only time he's ever on the national scene is when these forged letters, supposedly from George to him, are published. So, not the best way to get your name in the papers, but that is how it happened. So, that blows over, and Lund is still taking care of everything at Mount Vernon when the British come. And the British sail up the Potomac, and the admiral, or he wasn't an admiral yet, he would be later, but Captain Thomas Graves is leading this small fleet, and they're coming up the Potomac and burning Patriot houses. Burning down the houses of Patriots. So, he comes up, and he actually gets off the ship and goes and talks to Lund and says, hey, I won't burn down your house if you give me a bunch of supplies. He actually says, according to a conversation that Lund had afterward that was recorded, Graves comes off the ship and says, I have too much respect for General Washington and how he carries himself to burn down his house. I'm burning down all these other Patriot houses. Like, you can look down the river and see your neighbor's houses up in smoke. But I have too much respect for Washington to burn down his house. So if you can just give me some provisions, I won't do it. And Lund stands up and says, when the general left, he told me this might happen, and he was ready to sacrifice everything for his country, which is the instructions George Washington gave him. He said, if the British come, I don't want them to burn down my house, but I understand the sacrifice I'm making for my country. I'm willing to sacrifice my life. My property comes after that. So Graves goes back to his ship, and then he calls for Lund again. He says, hey man, why don't you come on board, we'll have some tea, we'll talk about it. So Lund goes on board, and he brings some turkey. And maybe some wine, but we're sure about the turkey. Now this was him accepting an invitation, and he seems to have thought it proper as a guest to bring something to eat. This would come back to haunt him, but he gets on the ship, and they talk for a while, have some drinks, and eventually Graves says again, hey, listen, like, just give us some provisions to get further upriver, and we won't burn down your house. And at this point, not knowing what to do, he's the caretaker of the property. His job is to protect the property. He decides, hey, okay, I'll give you some provisions. I don't remember exactly off the top of my head. It was some cattle and some food and a bunch of wine, things like that, so they can keep going. I did forget to mention that several slaves had been taken right away. They came, and while they were meeting the first time, a bunch of the British took some of Washington's slaves. And it seems that Lund was trying to negotiate with this stuff to get the slaves back. That didn't happen. Graves takes the food and provisions and just leaves. I know slavery is not great. We don't want people to be slaves anyway. But this is a long time ago. So, they leave. Lund goes back in the house. He writes Washington right away. Unfortunately, this letter to Washington has been lost to history. But we do have Washington letter written back to him. And the Marquis de Lafayette had been coming and just missed the British. And we have his letter to Washington, which essentially says, hey man, your guy gave stuff to the British. You know this, right? And very interestingly, I noticed about that letter that, I'm going to say quotes here, that he talks about all these things, and Lafayette talks about the slaves, and he actually says, which means very little to me, because Lafayette was famously anti-slavery. He's like, I'm letting you know that they also took some slaves, though it means very little to me. Well, I thought that was hilarious. Maybe you don't. Again, talking about slavery, I probably shouldn't be laughing, but big Lafayette fan. Anyway, Washington, we have his letter back, and he writes back to Lund saying, hey, I told you, let them burn my house. How does it look when, first of all, he's very upset that he brought the turkey in the first place. It's one thing to meet with them, but to bring them refreshments, as he called them, is unacceptable. And the fact that, how am I supposed to say that the general of the Continental Army's house didn't burn down, but all his neighbors' houses could just burn down? Well, because I'm too rich and I bought my way out? Most of my neighbors are pretty rich too, man. And so he was real angry about it. Now, this was in 1781. Victory at Yorktown is just a few months later. The whole thing seems to blow over. Obviously, people don't hold a grudge against George Washington. And obviously he doesn't hold a grudge against Lund Washington because he continues to work there for at least several years, as far as I could trace. And just to finish up, if you've ever gone to or want to go to Mount Vernon, which still stands today and is not only a historical landmark, but a tourist attraction, well, you can thank Lund Washington for that. The general didn't thank him. General wanted you to not be able to visit his house, although I'm certain he would have built another one. Anyone who attends Mount Vernon should definitely give a little wink and a little nudge to Lund Washington. And if you're there, ask if the people if they know him. I'm sure they will. I do want to give a shout out to Michael Cicery, who turned me on to this story. He writes for the Journal of the American Revolution. If you're not familiar with Journal of the American Revolution, they do similar to what I do. They publish free historical American Revolution papers, but there are more. Mine's a blog. I learn something, I write about it. But as you can see in my footnotes, I don't source a whole lot. I try and let you know. I offer a book where you can learn more. I do a ton of research to make sure it's right, but publishing every day, running the whole show by myself, I just don't have that much time to source everything. It is something I'd hope to change in the future. If I could turn this into my full-time job, hashtag support me on Patreon. Thank you very much. But Michael Cicery wrote an article. It goes very much into detail that I discussed about Graves and Lund in their discussion at Mount Vernon. And there's a link to that in my article. So let me know if you have any questions. I'm going to take a drink of my water because I turned my air off and it's starting to get very hot in here. It's just a little too loud. Got a new wall unit just today. Very exciting to cool down the bedroom. As you might imagine, when the weather feels like 90 according to weather.com. I apologize. Feels like 97. So we're going to move on to Richard Caswell. Now, I've mentioned Richard Caswell several times. I thought I had written an article on Richard Caswell, but last week when I was discussing, and actually I am going to check on something as we're talking here that I might have even left out of the article. Richard Caswell, I thought I had written about, but apparently I hadn't. And last week when I wrote about James Moore, I went to link to his name, because when I read an article, if I put a name in there that I've already written about, I link to it, just to helps my website get higher up on Google, and it helps you if you're interested in learning more about that person. But I didn't. What do you know? And I am just realizing something as I was talking. I totally left this out of the article. So Richard Caswell was a fairly wealthy person in North Carolina. Kind of a rags to riches story. Blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah. In 1774, he was elected to go to the First Continental Congress, where he signed the Articles of Association. I have his name on the Articles of Association page on my website, and I forgot to put that in the article yesterday. Oh man, it's such an important part of his life, and I totally forgot. Good thing you guys are watching this weekly recap where I can talk about it. Good thing I rubbed my face too, made myself nice and purple red for you. Anyway, Richard Gazwal goes and signs the Articles of Association at the First Continental Congress. Comes back to North Carolina, is already in the militia, and takes charge of the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge, which we discussed last week. Him and Alexander Lillington had two different divisions, companies that they controlled, and they commanded the astounding early defeat at Moores Creek Bridge. And again, we talked about this last week, but the Patriots took like 850 prisoners and lost like 6 guys. An astounding defeat, especially so early in the war, and especially in the South, because again, this is 1776. They're still sieging Boston. Like, the British haven't even got to New York yet. That being said, he goes back to North Carolina, and Caswell helps write the first Constitution in North Carolina history, after which he's respected by his peers and appointed as the first acting governor, after which he is elected as the first governor, and he serves the maximum 3 years as governor for the first 3 years of North Carolina statehood. Now, during this time, technically he's the chief executive and commander of North Carolina militia forces. So after he leaves, after he can't be governor anymore, well, he's appointed as Major General in the North Carolina militia, and he fights with them on several occasions. Now, unfortunately, he is one of the generals who loses at the Battle of Camden. Battle of Camden was probably the worst American defeat of the war. It was an absolute slaughter, and really kind of embarrassed Horatio Gates out of the position of commander of Southern Department. From what I read about Caswell's particular involvement, there were a bunch of Virginia militia in front who got scared and retreated, disorganized retreat, and that scared Caswell's men, who also disorganized, retreated, and he couldn't get them back under control. He doesn't seem to receive any blame for anything that went on, nor am I trying to blame him. So he goes back, and after the war ends, well, what do you know? He's elected as the 5th governor of North Carolina, and he spends another maximum 3 consecutive years as governor of North Carolina. And what I noticed is he left governor and the first governor in 1780, and then 4 years later in 1785, I guess 5 years later, because I can't count. 5 years later, he's the 5th governor, which means there's only 3 guys in those 5 years. So his 6 years seemed like a lot when 3 other guys only total 5 years. So obviously he did a good job, not only running it during wartime, but then running it after the war and leading them into nationhood, essentially. He would have left in 88, which is right as ratification process was going on, but brought North Carolina and made it a state, essentially. Again, a lot of people involved in that, but he seems to be the most important. Okay, any questions? No? You guys nice and quiet today? You're going to wait until the very end? I'm okay with that. That seems to be what usually happens. 45 minutes. We're doing great. We're doing great. And we're going to finish up now with Federalist Number 83. I do want to say that this book, a little hint and a nudge, the article coming out tomorrow was also inspired by this book. It was a, it's a secret. No, it's not. I just forgot who I wrote about yesterday. There's so many founders. There's so many founders in my life. Oh man, it's really gonna bother me. It's really gonna bother me. Anyway, well, I'll find out tonight when I publish it, and you'll see it tomorrow. Federalist number 83. Alexander Hamilton talks about trial by jury in civil cases. So the United States Constitution specifically states that in criminal cases, when someone commits a crime and might end up going to jail, they always get a trial by jury. You get a trial by peers. Anti-Federalists read this as, oh, you don't get a trial by jury in civil cases. And Hamilton basically points out, not necessarily, we're just leaving that up to Congress to decide, for several reasons. First of all, civil cases often involve businesses and complicated accounting measures and trades and stocks and finances. And your average citizen might not understand the nuance in all of these types of transactions. So to get a fair trial, a jury might not be the case. Now that sometimes it might be, but not always. So we didn't want to just say it in the Constitution that no, always they get a trial by jury. We're going to leave it up to the Senate and the Congress to decide what types of cases get a trial by jury. He also discusses the idea of liberty, where he says a criminal case, you're going to go to jail and we're going to take your liberty from you. So you always need to get a trial by jury. A civil case, you're probably not going, there's probably not going to jail. If you found guilty, you probably get a fine, or you have to give someone back this money you took from them, something like that. But that's money, not liberty. And notably, the Declaration of Independence, which is not law at all, but Thomas Jefferson famously changed life, liberty, and property to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So there were less hurt feelings about taking away your money, aka your property, than there used to be, one would imagine. And that is a brief summation of Federalist 83, which, by the way, is the longest Federalist paper, and I managed to do it in like 2.5 minutes. Let me know if you have any questions, because we are pretty much at the end here. Can't tell you how much I appreciate you guys watching, supporting the website, supporting Founder of the Day, hitting like on my videos. It's tremendous. I just broke 200 subscribers this week, which is mind-boggling for me. I know it doesn't sound like a lot because so many people have like 1 million subscribers. Like, I don't ever expect that. Obviously this is a very specific channel where I talk about very specific topics, but I actually was planning on doing like a, hey, broke 200 subscribers video. But then last week I had 196 on Friday, and I was like, oh, okay, maybe I'll do that next week. And then Monday comes around, I got 204. It was a very good week. Hey, Ned. Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for watching. It's 9 o'clock. It's everyone's bedtime on the East Coast. If you have any last minute questions, now's the time. But other than that, thank you so much for watching. And I will be back tomorrow with the founder that I forgot who it was. But I wrote it already, so it's coming. Thanks, guys. I will see you tomorrow.